Well, we are delighted to have all of you here. This is very formal looking. It's being recorded. And this is an event co-hosted by the Weatherhead Research Cluster on Identity and Conflict, and also by the Global Scholars Network on Identity and Conflict. So we're really delighted to have this event recorded so that not only can we in the room enjoy it, but future generations can benefit from your wisdom. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Max Bergholz, who's Associate Professor of History at Concordia University, and he's been teaching there for over a decade. He received his PhD in Balkan and East European history at the University of Toronto, and his interests include micro-historical approaches to the history of modern Europe, with a particular focus on the local dynamics of nationalism, intercommunal violence, and historical memory. So you can imagine why this is relevant to our collective interests. And his fieldwork has focused on Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, and Serbia, where he researches in central and provincial archives and conducts oral history interviews in small towns and villages. And I should say that when I first started thinking about doing work in the Balkans, which I'm doing myself now, Max is one of the first people that I was referred to and very generously shared some of his experiences, wisdom, and contacts with me, which helped to launch my own research. So let me just say a few words about Max's work. His first book, Violence as a Generative Force, Identity, Nationalism, and Memory in a Balkan Community, was published in 2016 by Cornell University Press. And it investigates the causes and dynamics of violence during 1941 in a multi-ethnic community that straddles the present-day border between Bosnia and Croatia. And he looked in particular on the effects on local identities and social relations. And this is a major prize-winning book. The book has won at least 5 prizes. I'm not going to name them all, but there's a lot of prizes up there. There's also a Bosnian edition of the book, which was published in 2018, and it was named a 2019 Book of the Year in Croatia by a newspaper there. There's been more editions of the book, and there is even a Chinese edition. So congratulations on that.
With a different title.
With a different title, okay.
The censors didn't like violence as a generative force.
Oh,
so
okay.
they
Yeah,
changed it.
I can imagine that. Yeah, you might even find this book in an airport near you soon. Okay. So he is currently researching and writing a book entitled Deafening Silences, Intercommunal Violence and the Challenge of Telling Human and Inhuman Histories, which investigates how 3 distinct governments and their local supporters in the Croatian town of Glina attempted in the 1940s onward to confront the memory of that town's violent past. So I'm really delighted. We're going to hear about some of that work and really delighted to hear more about this research. And I think what's really exciting here, we are an interdisciplinary group, is to hear from a historian who's been deep in the field, deep in the archives, and speaks to so many questions that those of us that use different methods and different approaches also care about a lot. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for taking time to come and listen to me speak today. So what I want to do, I want to pick up right where Melanie left off in terms of this new book project that is now slowly getting underway. My work is moving much slower now because I have a 5 and a 7-year-old, which is a different way of life compared to when I was researching my first book. But what I want to do today is sketch out the story that I want to tell in this book. I'm currently researching it, and I've done some preliminary writing, but what I'm trying to do is sketch out the overarching framework for the story itself. Before I tell you the outline of that story, which is the heart of my talk today, I want to briefly tell you how I came upon this subject, because in a sense, there's a story to finding this story that I think is relevant. So, to back up nearly 20 years to a December afternoon, a very dreary day in the capital city of Croatia in Zagreb, I was sitting in the Croatian State Archive, which is a massive reading room. It used to be the National Library in the first part of the 20th century. And on this day, I remember looking up and seeing the only staff person in the reading room dozing at her desk. just kind of falling asleep. This was maybe 3 or 4 o'clock, just before closing. And that day, I had spent my time slowly sifting through files for the Communist Party's Veterans Organization, which was formed in 1947. And among its main tasks, according to the former president of Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito, who also happened to be the president of this organization, was the goal of remembering, and these are Tito's words, everything we are proud of, while also forgetting everything that we are not proud of. And I was looking this day to try and discover a local case study, to research where I might discover something new about how villagers or residents in a small town struggled to remember or, following Tito's words, forget aspects of the intercommunal violence that had taken place in this part of Europe between 1941 and 1945. This entire day I had devoted many hours to reading lots of boring documents. And I was tired, and I was frustrated, and I had found nothing. And I was just about ready to go home. I looked at some of the last folders on the desk, and I was debating whether I should open any more or simply send them back. I decided to open one last folder. And I quickly scanned over the typed pages. And soon my eyes froze on several paragraphs that had been written on February 12, 1963. They were strikingly different from everything else I had read that day. The person who wrote the letter was named Adam Petrovich Gigac, and he lived in a small Croatian town that I had never heard of. The town was called and is called Glina, just to give you a sense. This is a map in Croatian, but this is the map of the former Yugoslavia after the Second World War. So Glina is located here. This green zone here was the former Republic of Croatia, today the country of Croatia. Petrovac Gigac wrote in this letter about a massacre which had taken place in this town during the summer of 1941. Local Croatian nationalists, who were known as Ustašas, had brought scores of Serbian Orthodox peasants to this town, to the town's Serbian Orthodox Church. And then they proceeded to kill many of them inside their church. Not long after, the Ustašas demolished this church. And yet, in spite of the massive efforts by the communist authorities to build monuments to many of those killed in this part of Europe between 1941 and 1945, this place in Glina, where this Serbian Orthodox Church had once stood, remained empty in 1963. And Petrovac Gigac indicated in this letter that a new Serbian Orthodox Church had in fact been built recently, albeit at a different location. And his letter seemed to be a very stark warning to the communist authorities about the need for an urgent reorientation, about how this violence in Glina during 1941 needed to be remembered. So in his words, quote, "As long as the site stands empty where a massacre of this magnitude took place, it will serve as a permanent source for the growth of chauvinism." And in place of this silence, he recommended a new approach. Again, his words, "Every act toward memorializing the site of the church would reduce, if not eliminate, the basis for the growth of political problems of an ethnic nature." For Petrovac Gigac, the lack of a memorial on the site had become now again his words, a political problem. And the ongoing lack of effort to build a memorial would only bring further political and moral problems, as well as what he called negative repercussions. So I read these words that afternoon, and my sense of exhaustion and boredom immediately vanished. And I had almost a physical sensation of a kind of electricity zooming through my body, and I remember standing up and walking around the reading room. I couldn't sit still after I read this letter. And I had a profound sense that I had stumbled upon the very faint outlines of a dramatic story, first of horrific violence, and then deafening silence, which had lasted for decades. It seemed to me that there was a story trapped in these paragraphs that was waiting to be told, and that needed to be told, but also needed to be first uncovered. Not long after this moment of discovery in the archive, I woke up on an equally dreary December morning. I took a packed tram to Zagreb's central bus station. I bought a ticket to the town of Glina, a place I had never been to. After we arrived to Glina's tiny and nearly deserted bus station, I disembarked and I made my way to the town's center, where I barely encountered anyone. The place seemed devoid of life. I was in search of the site of the old Orthodox Church that Petrovac Gigac had written about in 1963 in his letter. And along the way, I passed by many abandoned buildings like this one. This is a photograph from a different season, obviously summer, during another trip that I took. I also noticed, not long after passing this building, a brand new and very large Catholic church. And 50 or 60 meters after passing this church, I could see the new Orthodox Church with its steeple reaching for the sky. But it was located on a street about 1 block away from where the first Orthodox Church had been built, where the massacres had taken place in 1941. And then finally I arrived to the place that I was looking for. I turned and I stared at an unimpressive, geometrically constructed building, which looked like it had been built sometime during the second half of the 20th century. This building right here. And I noted the signs above the building's doors, which read Knjižnica I Čitaonica, or library and reading room. I walked closer. I stood underneath the Croatian flag that was flying in the wind, and I read the words on the sign, which read in the local language, or in Croatian, as follows: Hrvatski dom, which means Croatian house. And I stood there and I just stared for a moment. Here was a place where a Serbian Orthodox Church once stood, and where extreme Croatian nationalists massacred those whom they categorized as Serbs inside that church. And I wondered to myself, how is this place now called the Croatian House? As soon as I pondered this question, I then wondered how today in Glina there is nothing on this place, on this site, that recalls the traumatic violence of 1941 that Petrovac Gigac wrote about with such urgency in February 1963. And this scene is even more striking today, 20 years later, especially after the application of a fresh coat of paint to this building in recent years, and the painting of even larger letters which seem to spell out almost loudly Hrvatski dom, or Croatian house. This is what it looks like today. So these moments during the cold and dimly lit days of December 2005, first in the empty reading room of the Croatian State Archive and then on the deserted streets of Glina, marked my point of departure of trying to uncover this history. I took a long detour, Melanie talked about this at the beginning during her introduction, of about 10 years, even more than 10 years, once I discovered another local case study, the small town in northwestern Bosnia that I eventually devoted all of my attention to and wrote my first book about. But I never forgot this story of Glina, and it is to that story that I'm now returning in my current work. This story can be sketched out more fully, and what I want to do is sketch it out a bit more fully today through a series of scenes, which I want to describe now. The question of how the scenes are connected and why I think they have meaning for us today, not simply in this corner of Europe, but more broadly in many other parts of the world where conflicts have either taken place or are still ongoing, is something that I'll reflect about at the very end of my talk. So the first scene. The first scene takes us to the town of Glina nearly 85 years ago, during the first half of May 1941. This is Glina's Orthodox Church, which is where today the Croatian House stands. This is Glina's Orthodox Church in 1940. Green leafy trees line Glina's street. The air in the town's largest park, located just beyond the Orthodox Church, which we can see here, was fragrant with the smell of spring flowers. Local residents of different Christian faiths, some Catholic, others Orthodox, with the former usually seeing themselves as Croats and the latter as Serbs, generally interacted peacefully in their shared markets, bakeries, schools, parks, hospitals, on soccer fields, and in all the other places that made up their daily lives. Up to the middle of May 1941, no historian would be able to find significant evidence, or really any evidence, I would say, of mass interethnic violence among these people in Glina and its wider region. But there were individuals in this town who held extremist views, and they had unexpectedly come to assume power over the lives of all the town's residents the previous month, which witnessed the invasion of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia by the Axis powers and the establishment of a new state called the Independent State of Croatia, under the leadership of a man named Ante Pavelić and his fascist organization known as the Ustašas. Pavelić and his associates, some of whom lived in Glina, wanted to create a pure Croatian nation state that would be free of all the people whom they defined as non-Croatian. And so in Glina, this meant that those whom the Ustašas viewed as Orthodox Serbs, first and foremost, were now to be targeted for elimination. Only days later, on the night of May 12, 1941, this small peaceful town would rapidly transform into a site of mass killing. On that night, local Ustašas, supported by others who arrived on buses from Zagreb, went from house to house, and they arrested every male Serb in Glina between the ages of approximately 16 and 60. The next evening on May 13th, they were taken to a nearby village where the Ustašas killed all of them, 388 men and boys, except one man who managed to escape. His name was Nikola Samardzija. He was a shoemaker, and he was known to have played on a soccer team that was made up of players who were both Catholic and Orthodox. We can only imagine the terror and anguish that the mothers, wives, sisters, aunts, and other children of those killed lived with in the days following this secret massacre. When relatives went to the local police station to ask about the fate of the men, they were told coldly that they had been sent to Germany for work. This mass violence then ceased for 2 months. There was no more killing. But then it exploded again after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Only days later, local communist-oriented insurgents, most of whom in this part of Europe, in this town, and in its vicinity, were Serbian, launched an attack on a train station near Glina. And so in response, the Ustašas unleashed a wave of violence against the region's Serbian population. They called these actions cleansing actions. And in one of them, they arrested approximately 400 Serbian men whom they brought to Glina. They locked them inside the town's Serbian Orthodox Church. And on the night of July 29th and into the morning of July 30th, inside this church, they shot to death approximately 300 of these prisoners. 2 men survived. They gave testimonies about their experiences after the war, and it's because of those 2 documents that we know about what took place inside this church. Less than a week passed before this violence resumed. Under the pretense that their lives would be spared if they converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism, as many as 2,000 Serb peasants from nearby villages were brought to Glina's Orthodox Church on the morning of August 4th. Instead of the Catholic priests that they expected to see for their life-saving religious conversion, they were instead greeted by Ustašas. Once again, Glina's Orthodox Church was to be used as a place of killing. The precise number of victims for this second massacre in the church remains disputed. This research is ongoing today. But the figure is thought to be somewhere around 1,000 victims. Witnesses who passed by the church during this process of killing recall that under the doors that were locked during this time, blood was flowing. A week later, on August 12th, the Ustashes in Glina gave the order for the church to be demolished. And in a matter of days, this site became what the poet Ivan Lalic would later call the place of wind where the church once stood. Here's a photograph from 1947, which can give us a sense of what inspired Lalic to write these words in the mid-1950s. The communists ultimately defeated the Ustashes in 1945, along with the occupying powers who had invaded and dismembered the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Already during the war, the communists had begun their work of reconstituting Yugoslavia as a new state, a socialist state, with a federalized structure, in which, crucially for them, all officially recognized nationalities would be treated with equality. And one of the cornerstones of the communist socialist revolution was their claim that all of the citizens of the Yugoslav lands had joined together in what they called brotherhood and unity, and they had all fought together to liberate their country. And so this supposed forging of brotherhood and unity meant that national questions and histories of interethnic violence, like what took place in Glina in 1941, were to be thought of after 1945 as something that existed only in the past, not in the present, and never again in the future. And while this may have sounded powerful at the level of political rhetoric, it created the basis for strange, disturbing, and deafening silences about the recent violent past in places like Glina. And so we can return again to the former site of the Orthodox Church and consider another scene from the post-war period. And we can ask what this place looked like, what it might have felt like, as the communists went about claiming that the memory of the massacres from 1941 could be addressed through their constant declarations about brotherhood and unity. This photograph was taken in around the middle 1950s, and it raises questions about what the daily experience may have been like living in the shadow of such violence, and, of course, the state-sanctioned imperative to remain silent about it. The place where Glina's Orthodox Church had once stood was a silent witness to the horrific instances of mass killing in that town during 1941. Yet from the time of those killings onward, there was nothing there that recalled these events. The site would remain empty until the very end of the 1960s. What did the relatives of the victims killed inside the church think as they walked through the town past this site? Did they think the church should be rebuilt? Did they want a monument built on this site in memory of their loved ones who had been killed in the church? What did those handful of survivors of the massacres in the church think as they walked to and from work past this site? What about those who profited in some way from the massacres, including people who used the stone from the demolished church to build new homes after the war? What did they think as they took their strolls past this church, past the site of the former church? The new communist leaders of Glina were acutely aware that despite their rhetoric of brotherhood and unity, the memory of the violent past, which they sought to silence, was still right there in the place where it had taken place in 1941. They were aware that this silence could be broken in a community where the scars over this violence were very thin. For example, during the last years of the 1940s, local Serbian peasants, in collaboration with representatives of the Serbian Orthodox Church, took it upon themselves to find out the locations where the victims had been buried. They took their carts, their horse-drawn carts, they brought along their agricultural tools to these sites, and they began digging. And they located hundreds and hundreds of bones, remains of the victims. And on several occasions, as those who unearthed these remains returned from work with their carts full of bones, they passed through Croatian villages, where it was thought some of the perpetrators had lived or were living at the time. In documents produced by the Communist Party, we know that sometimes these meetings, as the peasants passed through these villages, were fraught with tension, with local peasants, Serbian peasants, calling out to Croats in the village that one day they would kill them and put them in the same holes where they had just unearthed the bones of their relatives. So the communist authorities were aware of the sensitivity of this history, of the destabilizing confrontations that sometimes took place. And so to see the world through the eyes of the communist leaders, I don't think we should be surprised that they chose to do nothing with the site of the demolished Serbian Orthodox Church. Their vision of brotherhood and unity had no space for recalling a past with massacres perpetrated on an ethnic basis by neighbors against neighbors. They explicitly prohibited the rebuilding of a new church on this site, and they did so out of fear that a church rebuilt on this site would somehow become a shrine to the victims, and as such could become a place that might incubate a sense of interethnic victimization and generate nationalism and further ethnic conflict. Our next scene takes us to a hilltop in Glina, perhaps only a 15-minute walk from the Croatian House today, where it sits in the center of town, of course, on the site of the demolished Orthodox Church. If we could walk there today, we would soon arrive to these stairs, which would lead us upward under this canopy of trees toward the sky. Before arriving to the summit of the hill, if we turn to our right, this is the view we would have. This is Glina's Orthodox cemetery. This was the place where, in 1951, the communist authorities permitted the burial of the victims' remains. No individual victim was ever identified. Instead, all the remains were buried here in one single large grave. And the inscription was simple, but it also told some important facts about what took place during the summer of 1941. So the inscription, here on this site, read as follows: "Here lie the innocent victims of the terrible slaughter which the Ustasha evildoers carried out in the summer of 1941 in the service of the fascist occupiers, during which they killed in horrific ways more than 2,000 sons and daughters of the Serbian people." By confining this site of memory to the cemetery of the Serbian Orthodox Church, the communist authorities attempted to ensure that this memory would have little to no potential to stir up interethnic conflict. After all, it was highly unlikely that non-Serbs would ever enter this space. This was a place where Serbs could mourn their own dead in private. And so as such, this grave that was built in 1951, combined with the ongoing emptiness of the site where the church once stood in the center of the town, helped to enshrine what I call a wider public silence about Glina's history of mass violence in 1941. The communist authorities were the dominant political force in the town and in the country of Yugoslavia, but they were not the only ones who had ideas about how to remember the violent past. Eventually, they approved the request by the Serbian Orthodox Church to rebuild a new church in Glina on a new site a few hundred meters away from where the massacres had taken place. During the first years of the 1960s, volunteers worked tirelessly to construct the church, whose doors were opened officially on September 21st, 1963. That same church exists today. The mood that day was festive. Hundreds of people came from nearby towns and villages. They set up tables. They ate and drank and sang songs until late into the evening. And if we could walk inside that newly constructed church that day, we would encounter a scene which was perhaps unexpected, but also predictable. Confirming the fears of the local communist authorities, those who constructed the new Orthodox Church built inside of it a special altar in memory of the victims of the massacres of 1941. A stone from the site of the demolished church was brought and placed inside this altar. church members went to the site of the old church and filled a bottle with what they called blood-soaked earth. The victims were referred to, as you can see here, as Srpski mučenici, or Serbian martyrs. No part of the altar stressed any aspect of what the communists called brotherhood and unity. It was a place constructed to mourn and remember Serbian victims killed by Croatian Ustašas. 3 months after the festive opening of the church, Petrovac Gigac sat down to write the letter that I discovered in December 2005. Of course, the first time I heard of this town. He explained that the opening of the church, combined with the ongoing emptiness of the site where the first church had stood, had now created a problem with a very serious political character. Petrovac Gigac argued that the vacant site would now become a source for the growth of Serbian chauvinism. And so what would soon happen was something that seemed unthinkable only a few years earlier. The communist authorities completely changed their opinion about what to do with the site. Now facing a direct challenge from the Serbian Orthodox Church over the memory of the victims, they declared that a memorial would now be built on the site of the church that had been demolished. And this brings us to our next scene. 6 years after the opening of the church, on July 4th, 1969, a large crowd gathered for the opening of what was called the Spomen Dom, or the Remembrance House. This modern structure had been built during the previous years on the site of the old Orthodox Church. The date of the opening of the Remembrance House had no connection to any of the violence that took place in Glina in 1941. July 4th was a day celebrated throughout the former Yugoslavia as Veterans Day. It was a day to celebrate partisan fighters who came together to resist the occupation of their country and liberate their country. And this choice of date tells us something about how the communist authorities sought to distance the Remembrance House from the interethnic violence that took place, even as they sought to build a memorial on the site. In speeches given that day, high-level politicians like Miko Tripalo generally referred to the victims not as Serbs, which was the reason why they were killed, but rather simply as innocent victims. There was a sculpture placed in front of the Remembrance House of a mother and child, even though the victims of the massacres were all men. A plaque next to the sculpture, which you can't see here, but existed at that time from the 1969 onward, was carved in Latin letters rather than Cyrillic, even though the latter was and is the script used by the Serbian Orthodox Church, as well as local residents who would have described themselves as Serbs. Its inscription was notable for its use of language which obscured historical agency in this violence. The inscription read as 1,200 innocent people found death inside the church, by the blade of the Ustasha knife. If anyone gathered that day for the opening of the Remembrance House did not know the history of what had taken place, this plaque would not have clarified anything to them. No relatives of the victims were invited to speak. No representatives of the Serbian Orthodox Church were invited. In fact, that shouldn't be surprising at all. Part of the reason for building the Remembrance House was to counter the challenge that had been laid down by the Serbian Orthodox Church, not just in reconstructing the church, but also in building the altar. After a short period of what appears to have been a certain level of satisfaction among many residents in Glina that at least something had finally been built on the site, criticisms began to emerge. The Remembrance House was a memorial that had a significant level of social functionality. It included places for children to play games, for young people to dance. There was a small movie theater inside. Letters were written in the 1970s in which people expressed anguish and anger that these kinds of activities were allowed to take place on a site where so many people had been killed. There were debates about how many people had actually been killed and whether the number of 1,200 was accurate. Some people felt that the adjective Croatian needed to be added so that it was clear who the Ustashas were ethnically. Some people felt that the phrase innocent people should be changed into Serbs. And so, taken together, the criticisms that emerged in the years following the opening of the Remembrance House amounted to an indictment of its capacity to function as a site of memory that reflected the desires and histories of the people who had experienced this violence. The discontent crystallized by the mid-1980s with the formation of a council whose job was to recommend renovations to the site, to make the site more historically accurate and more emotionally evocative as a site of memory. The proposals that were put forth, however, caused the communist authorities to fear what the local population had in mind and what they wanted to do in terms of changing the site. And we can appreciate that by looking at a model that was designed by two members of this council, one of whom was a painter and the other one was a sculptor. As you can see, the floor for the remembrance room that they wanted to design would be red, so that anyone who entered this room inside the Remembrance House would realize that blood was essentially on the floor in 1941. The painting that we see at the front showed a partially destroyed church along with heads of victims on the floor and knives which were used for decapitation. And the words we see here written in Cyrillic say in English, "The truth is written in our blood." The four plaques, sorry, just to go back to the original picture, the four plaques that you see here, I don't have closer up views of them. I actually interviewed these two individuals who created this design. The four plaques, so I read what was there, but I don't have photographs to show you. The four plaques, two on each side, were to contain the testimony of one of the Ustashas who carried out the killings after he was arrested and interrogated. So the words would essentially be him talking about killing people. The painting to the left depicts rows of local Serbs, including an Orthodox priest. Their hands are bound. They are waiting to be converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism. They don't know that that was simply a lie that they were told, and they are about to be killed. The painting on the right shows a woman expressing immense grief and sorrow as she stands in a sea of corpses. Outside the Remembrance House, this plan recommended that the sculpture of the woman and child, which had been put there in 1969, be taken away. And that on the same plaza, a sculpture that would symbolize the entrance of the old church would be placed there that would look like this. And along the plaza lining the entranceway to the memorial house, plaques were to be raised that would include all the first and last names of the victims, where they came from, and their ages when they were killed. These kinds of suggestions certainly can be seen as emanating from a powerful desire by members of this council and those in Glina and elsewhere in Yugoslavia who supported their work to remember this violent history in a way that, at least for them, better reflected key historical and even emotional truths from that year. But we can also appreciate how these sorts of proposals certainly held the potential to ignite tensions and conflicts in a multi-ethnic community, especially one in a state like Yugoslavia during the second half of the 1980s, which was beset first by very significant economic problems and then growing levels of elite-level nationalist conflict. If these sorts of changes were to be implemented in Glina, what effect might they have on Glina's residents and their interethnic relations? We'll never know the answer to that question. Before these changes could be approved and implemented to the Remembrance House, Yugoslavia began to break apart. The Republic of Croatia declared independence from the Yugoslav Federation at the end of June 1991. The preceding year, the League of Communists had lost its political monopoly. And in Croatia, replacing the communists were a host of political parties. A host of political parties emerged, the most powerful of which were organized along ethnic lines. In Glina, as in other parts of Croatia where Serbs were counted in high numbers, there was a strong desire among most to remain in Yugoslavia. And so most of them supported a party called the Serbian Democratic Party. Yet once the Croatian nationalists, who were more numerous, who organized themselves into another political party called the Croatian Democratic Union, began moving in the direction of declaring independence, these Serb nationalists in Glina, like their colleagues elsewhere in Croatia, took up arms, and they unilaterally declared their own para-state, which in this part of Croatia they called the Serb Autonomous Region of Krajina. And so just to give you a sense of all the regions where Serbs declared their own independence from Croatia, this gives you a sense. So Glina, of course, is here. So it constituted part of this para-state. In doing so, they brought memories of 1941 into very sharp focus as they prepared during late 1990 and early 1991 to now engage in violence against their Croatian neighbors. The new coat of arms they designed with a text not just in Serbian, but also in English, in order to communicate to the wider world their identity, tells us very clearly how they viewed 1941 as a justification, as a basis for their actions now in 1991. Glina, Grad, Mučenik, as you can see here, 1941 and 1991, the martyr town. In this image, we can take note of a very understudied aspect of memory politics. So it's often thought that the breaking of silences, I was talking with Melanie about this earlier today, the breaking of silences about the traumatic past, which more nationally minded Serbs in Glina had been trying to accomplish for decades about the 1941 massacres, will provide a kind of basis for truth-telling, and thus can provide a basis for intergroup reconciliation. Yet in Glina, the opportunity that the collapse of communism presented to tell a more complete truth about 1941 resulted in a context in which nationalists and memory activists chose to use traumatic memories to mobilize people for new waves of violence. It's worth noting that on July 26, 1991, which was the day when the Serb rebels completed their violent takeover of Glina's police station, local Serb political leaders issued a statement to their Croatian neighbors and all Croat political leaders. It's worth listening to some of those words. Quote, "Exactly 50 years ago, the Ustašas of the independent state of Croatia carried out a notorious massacre inside Glina's Orthodox Church. 1,500 people were slaughtered in this sacred place, a crime the world before had never witnessed. For 50 years, the Serbian people forgave that crime, but they never forgot it. This year, on July 26, 1991, in honor of their victims who were killed innocently in the church, because they were Serbs and because they were Orthodox, a commemoration was held in Glina that resembled nothing done before. The Serbian people, who will never forget their victims of the Ustašas and their crimes, have now thrown out and will continue to throw out this new generation of Ustašas who have come to Glina. This kind of commemoration does not resemble what used to take place, but it is necessary and it is just, and has been done in the name of 1,500 victims who were slaughtered in the Orthodox Church. It has been done in the name of 500 well-known Serbs, now referring to the massacre in May of 1941. killed on one night in May 1941, and it was done in the name of hundreds of burnt houses and many black headscarves worn in sorrow by our mothers. And so this is the question posed to the entire Croat population. Do you not yet understand why the Serbian people are ready to fight and give their lives? So, if Serbs could be thought of as martyrs in 1941, in 1991, they would now use violence to ensure that this experience would never be repeated. And so during the next 4 years, in supposed defense of their communities and lives, and in the name of their victims from 1941, the Serb rebels in Glina would kill 387 of their Croatian neighbors. They would completely destroy 33 of their villages, and they would expel thousands and thousands of residents from this new para-state. While they committed this violence, which they justified in large part by reference to their memories of 1941, they worked tirelessly in the town of Glina to reshape the Remembrance House. And so here's a photograph from July 30th, 1995. They made renovations during this period of what is called the war in Croatia to this site. They implemented most of the recommendations of the council that I talked about a little bit earlier from the 1980s. And so on July 30th, 1995, a ceremony was held, essentially reopening this site with a new form of memory. Members of the Serbian Orthodox Church were there, and they led the ceremony. The church's patriarch expressed his wish for peace for both the Serbian people as well as what he called their enemies. The horrible crimes in Glina during 1941, he said, could not be forgotten. The president of Glina's municipality directed the crowd of hundreds to look at the many names on the plaques, which you can see here, lining the two sides of the plaza. Their memory, he said, should provide those today with the strength to hold their territory and defend their town from Croats. And so this strange scene of a community recalling its victims from a series of massacres half a century earlier, while using this memory to justify their own contemporary violence, and imperative to commit more violence in the future if need be, lasted through the end of this solemn day. And it would reverberate around Glina for just about one more week. On August 6, 1995, the Croatian army fought its way into Glina and retook the town and the entire occupied para-state after more than 4 years of occupation. Members of the Croatian military soon took decisions which now help us bring the story to the present, and I'll finish shortly. An order was given while the fight for Glina was ongoing to remove all objects built illegally during the occupation, the Serbian occupation. This order set the stage for the destruction of every single one of the changes made to the Remembrance House. Croatian soldiers arrived to the plaza with heavy equipment, and they smashed every single one of the plaques in front of the Remembrance House. They took away the sculpture that symbolized the arch of the entrance to the church. And 3 weeks later, on September 23rd, 1995, Glina's new municipal government gave an order to rename the Remembrance House as the Croatian House, which is what it is still called today. Just like I saw in 2005, just like we can see in the photograph of how it looks today. And so this brings us to the final scene. It returns us back to where we began. I wondered, as I said at the beginning of my lecture on my first visit, long before I knew any of this history, how it was possible that this place, where a Serbian Orthodox Church once stood, where in 1941 extreme Croatian nationalists massacred hundreds of those whom they categorized as Serbs, could today be called the Croatian House. The story I've tried to tell today explains why. None of us should be surprised that after 4 years of war from 1991 to 1995 in Glina and its surrounding region, with hundreds of people categorized as Croats murdered, with thousands of them forced from their homes, with their villages destroyed to their foundations, that today in Glina, there is no desire among Croats to recall the Ustasha violence against Serbs in 1941? Is this approach to remembering the violent past offensive to people who call themselves Serbs in Croatia today and in Glina? Yes, it is. But is this position nonetheless understandable if we endeavor to see the world through the eyes of those who insist on silencing this past? I would answer once again, yes, it is. The answers, or these answers, suggest that those who care about remembering the violent past in this part of Europe have been and remain deeply opposed to each other. After 1945, the communists sought to silence the ethnic dimensions of the massacres in Glina during 1941 to promote brotherhood and unity. Serb-minded communists and nationalists rightly wanted to break this decades-long silence. Yet when their opportunity finally arose, they used the memory of this violence as a justification for unleashing their own violence in 1991. And Croatian nationalists, in reaction to the rebellion by Serbs between 91 and 95, have sought to silence the memory of 1941 from the end of the war to the present day. All of the historical actors in this story appear on first glance as fundamentally different. And what they want to remember seems to be just as different. And this helps explain why histories in this part of Europe tend to be written in extremely selective ways, with supporters of each group telling only the stories they want to hear, while ignoring and silencing the stories of others. And in this sense, they vividly exemplify the words of the Vietnamese-American scholar and novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen, who has written the following memorable sentences in his study of the memory of the war in Vietnam. Quote, "All wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory." But I wonder if we might be able to retell this history of violence, silence, and memory in a new way that might hold the potential to destabilize and perhaps even transcend this sense of never-ending conflict. And that may seem like a lofty, even utopian objective. But how we tell stories matters. As the late Alain Coffino, a historian of Germany, Israel, Palestine, and memory, has written in his more recent work on Israel-Palestine, quote, "The power of historical storytelling is that it can open our minds to others as fully human. We cannot change our mind, or shall we say our heart, without telling a story. All good stories are political because identifying with the other is political," end quote. When I tell this story of Glina, and when I try to think about what it means today, what stands out to me are not those enormous differences that I just described. Rather, it is their striking similarities. The actors involved seem less like enemies and more, I would say, like brothers, as members of the same family. To me, they look like people who, despite their vastly different historical experiences, their different views of the past and the present, and their different political ideologies, have nonetheless behaved in strikingly similar ways when it comes to remembering the violent past. All these actors are deeply concerned with what Nguyen has called the basic dialectic of memory and amnesia. Again, in his words, remembering our humanity and forgetting our inhumanity, while conversely remembering the inhumanity of others and forgetting their humanity. In so doing, none of these groups have the slightest interest in fostering what Nguyen calls a just memory, which means a view of the violent past in which we acknowledge, as he puts it, the human inhabits the inhuman, both in the people whose stories we tell and in us, since we are no different. Fostering a just memory would seem to entail the imperative to renounce a memory of the violent past as based on mutually exclusive myths, and instead choosing to confront one characterized by mutually coexisting truths. It may not be possible to recognize these often painful and opposing truths, but creating a just memory would seem to demand that they be acknowledged. And so this story of the space where the church once stood in Glina raises a series of questions that challenge us to think again about how we set limits around what in the violent past can be remembered and what must remain silenced. And here, this story of a small Croatian town echoes out far away from this part of Europe. And its message and meaning touches many pain-filled and violent parts of our contemporary world, such as Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Syria, to name just a handful. Where, of course, how we remember and silence the violent past continues to have deadly consequences. Can we recall our terrible losses, yet still acknowledge the losses of others, including those with whom we may have been and perhaps still are in conflict? Can we see ourselves as victims and as people who may have victimized others? Can we see those others who have hurt us also as people whom we may have hurt? Nguyen argues in his work that our likely answer to these questions, that is, no, suggests a very pessimistic view of the future when it comes to the challenge of fostering a just memory about the violent past. Again, a few more of his words. When we say always remember and never forget, what we really wish to remember and never forget is our humanity and the inhumanity of others. And yet, when we tell the story of Glina and when we consider those involved less as enemies and more as brothers, and when we confront the fact that these deeply opposed historical actors have in fact behaved in such similar ways, both as human and inhuman, as both victims of deafening silences and those who have no qualms about silencing others, we discover an uncomfortable truth that challenges us to approach this painful history anew. We are hurt and we desperately want to remember our losses, and we refuse to acknowledge how we hurt others and cause their losses. In confronting that truth, however much or however little we can, we face the challenge of acknowledging that those others feel the exact same way. And in that acknowledgement, a choice then can come into focus. To take a step away from the endless cycle of mutual silencing, which is our way of fighting the war over the violent past. In taking that step, if only for a fleeting moment, we might catch a glimpse of a strange new world in which the memory of the violent past might rise anew, this time on a foundation of our mutually coexisting truths. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Well, I'm trying to recover here. We have about half an hour for questions, discussion. So why don't you field your own questions? I'm happy to do it for you, but I think you're probably more than capable of doing it yourself.
I've taught a class or two.
Yes. So let's open it up. And if we have a lot of questions, maybe cluster a few together.
I have one simple clarifying question.
Yeah.
To whom was the letter that Petrov wrote addressed?
He was writing to the Republican Organization of Veterans in Croatia, so to the central leadership within that republic of what were called, the organization at that time was called Savez Udruženja Boraca Narodno-oslobodilačkog rata, so the Association of Veterans of the People's Liberation War. He was writing to the people, the committee, the executive committee of that organization. Yes, Sandra.
I'm going to pass around the mic for questions. Sure. Yeah. Is this on? Is good? Okay.
I also have just a clarifying question because I'm just curious. Did you find out, and this is just curiosity, what ethnicity was Petrovich? What's his Gigats? Yeah. I'm just only asking because I'm trying to figure out, was he in a sense representing the communist government in Glina and asking on that behalf, or was he asking on behalf of a particular ethnic group, which would be less likely at the time, but still? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And raises all kinds of interesting, shall we say, it's a fraught terrain in any history, but in particular histories of this part of the world, when you feel you can identify someone with an ethnic adjective that somehow you can then interpret why they do what they do, which is not always the case. So he was ethnically Serbian, but based on my analysis of his readings and talking with local historians, he was someone who was thinking kind of with his communist hat on at the time, and was most concerned with how the Serbian Orthodox Church was essentially had made a very significant move to assert power over the remembrance of these victims. And as a person on the terrain in this town, he was writing for assistance and support to reorient, right? And essentially not to work with the church, but to essentially reassert power back over this space and over the memory of what had taken place. He was very concerned about what was happening in the church. And there are some scholars in Croatia who have also looked at some of these documents, because there's new work that has come out in the last 10 years or so. A book was published just a few years ago, which is the size of like an old telephone book. I read it 2 summers ago and I lost circulation in my legs because it's printed on very high quality paper. And there's a scholar there who analyzed Gigatz's letters and simply felt that he was exaggerating the fear of inter-ethnic destabilization. And this is a strange claim to make, because that article also had no analysis of Communist Party surveillance during the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. As if Gigatz's letters did not occur in a political context. When you look at the party documents, you see significant tension and concern about the tension. And so I think that helps explain where he was coming from. He wanted to protect brotherhood and unity, and he was Serbian. Because he was Serbian did not mean that he was somehow not supportive of communist objectives. Yeah.
Especially in the 1960s.
Exactly, at that time, yeah, exactly. You have a different situation in the 1980s, particularly the end of the 1980s, where there's a movement by people, let's say, of the same sort of profile toward the Serbian Democratic Party, right? But that's a different context. Yeah. How about we start in the back and then just come back to the first question, first person who asked the question.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting and informative. And I'm still trying to gather my breath because it was yeah. So I think the narrative that you told, very well exposes the sort of the duality of monuments, right? On the one hand, they can serve as recognition for victimhood. On the other hand, they can serve to transmit kind of intergenerational grievances that don't allow communities to heal, that can mobilize against a shared society. And I think that was really well exposed. Then your conclusions, which go beyond what you've kind of exposed, hint at the problem of competitive victimhood. And I'm just wondering, where in your research, whether you've actually found that kind of reasoning amongst decision makers when they were trying to think about what they're going to build and how.
It's a great question. I'm coming at this project, in stages. So I've done a lot of the research, the empirical work, through the 1960s, and much less from the 70s to the present. So part of the finale of the lecture is really me trying to think through, kind of the so what question. Why would a micro study on this small town matter beyond, publishing a book for an audience, say, in Croatia? So today, like literally in October of last year, on the streets, which would essentially be right here, what's called the Serbian National Council in Croatia opened its own cultural center, so that they can have a physical space in which to develop not just activities and different kind of events around things Serbian, but also to have an archive and a place to gather data and documents about 1941, among other subjects as well. So And there's been a constant push for years to try to have Hrvatski Dom taken away and Spomen Dom returned. So in today's world, like right now, this is a competition and this is a battle that is ongoing right now. And exactly that. So the 1941, there's a great desire by Serbs in Glina as well as throughout Croatia to have 1941 remembered. 1991 doesn't seem to need to be part of that story for them. Within the Croatian population in Glina, but also more widely, 1941 should be forgotten and perhaps will not even need to be told as a story of genocide. That's a word that is not really allowed to be used right now. And so each of these groups essentially wants certain dates and certain events enshrined physically. So for Croats, 1991 to 1995 is the most important thing that this particular building can serve as a kind of reminder of. For Serbs, 41 and 95 when they were all expelled from Croatia. So the competition is quite severe in the more contemporary period. That's where I really see this dynamic unfolding right now. And that to me is really the reason why this subject, why I want to write this book. Less so about researching the violence of 1941. My first book was really about local dynamics of violence, and I think it's an important topic, and I want to see more research. I just don't really want to do much more of that research in the way that I was doing, like trying to build new theory about that type of work. I will tell that story to the extent that I can in the book, to the extent that I need to. But what I'm most really interested in is how, exactly as I said at the end of the lecture, groups seem to have different ideas about what needs to be remembered, different combinations of dates, different groups of victims, and yet when I look at their behaviors, they seem to really act in the exact same way. That to me really seems to be, when I look at this case, I see that then in so many other parts of the world as well. And that's where I think the book maybe might have potential to speak to a wider audience at a theoretical level. But thanks for your question. And it's still something I'm thinking through a lot at this point, so I appreciate that. Yeah.
May I?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, excellent talk. I'm sorry I didn't say that before I asked my first question.
Thank you.
So there's a little bit of a tension between the last few minutes of when you were speaking and then your response about Petrovac and his Serbian identity, in the sense that you were very careful not to want to ascribe to him particular motives in light of that identity. And so the tension that I see is that individual wanting to be careful about not ascribing specific motives based on an identity versus at the level of the group. And so this notion that at the level of the group, we are both human and inhuman, we want to forget this way. But surely within any possible social group, there's a ton of heterogeneity in terms of people's commitments to the groups, whether they think it's justifiable what it is that group is doing, how upset they are. There are many people, I'm sure, many people who are particularly exercised about the forgetting that weren't even alive at the time that 1941 happened. And so I'm really curious about how you think about the transmission of these things and how much the heterogeneity across people contributes, whether that could potentially be a way to start to pull apart at some of these sort of fractionalizing forces. I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about the individual level.
Yeah. It's a great question.
To give it more texture.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is one of the challenges that's waiting for me. So I've applied for some grants, and I want to spend the 25-26 year in Croatia doing much more research. And this also connects to another interest of mine. Your question, what I was thinking as you were talking was it has a lot to do with how I want to try and tell the story, and I want to make it vivid with characters, right, with people. So Petrovac Gigac would be one of these people, and some of the others would be, for example, the survivors. I'm interested, to the extent that I can discover, what did they think in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? One of them, for example, was expelled in 1995, one of the men who survived the killings in the church, and then came back to the region in the late 90s, right? So I'm actually I want to try and build the chapters around, to the extent that I can, life stories that cover as much of this period as possible, and to try and trace people's sense of the violent past as the decades unfold. The individuals, for example, who designed, all of this, for example, they had roots in this region as children. They managed to escape 1941 when they were under 10 years old. And most of them, the two individuals, the sculptor and the painter, Momčilo Krković, Dragan Čuprilić, they went to Belgrade and that's where they did their training at the Faculty of Fine Arts there. But Krković, for example, came back to the region in the 1960s, just before the Remembrance House was opened, a few years before, and he was asked to create kind of a series of potential designs which were put on display in the center of Glina for people to walk past and leave comments on, kind of a book. What do you like? What do you not like? So I'm trying to kind of identify characters that I can build into the narrative to exactly try to convey, as you put it, heterogeneity and kind of complicating ideas about historical memory that are not so black and white and kind of abstract at the level of the group. But it's going to depend on what I can uncover. And so that's that's kind of the research challenge. Yes, it's an empirical challenge, but it's connected to kind of a narrative challenge as well. And I don't want this to be a book that is, kind of just yet another contribution to the literature on memory. I want it first and foremost to be a story about people who have been through horrific circumstances, and then at certain points those that come after them, the community that they are engulfed into, in other words, to try and capture them, this becomes capable of committing similar types of violence later on. And the way in which those people who are subjected to that violence, that we feel like the pivots in the book that I feel are going to be the most powerful parts of the narrative, when I'm able to draw readers into identifying and feeling sympathy with certain groups, and then when it changes and they become the perpetrators themselves, it's in those pivots that I feel the narrative will have its greatest power and probably its greatest capacity to speak to like a wider audience. But of course, to the extent that I can uncover these stories, I'll do my best. But it's kind of an open. This is kind of a rough attempt to sketch out what I think are some of the big ideas in the narrative. But there's a lot of empirical work still to go. So I appreciate that question. I'll remember it as I go forward and keep eyes even more focused on that. So thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you again for your talk. So a couple summers ago, I was conducting field research in Belgrade, and a sign that stood out to me was the only genocide in the Balkans was against the Serbs. So I'm curious how you've seen the creation and the legality of the term genocide come up in your research and how it has affected maybe historical revisionism in Srebrenica.
Oh, in Srebrenica. Okay, that kind of pivoted me away for a minute. So let me make one comment that still roots us in Glina, and then I'll try to springboard off of that to Srebrenica. So one of my colleagues who's from Glina, and a local historian who's published an immense amount and has just an enormous archive of materials, he's about to publish his first monograph. And the title of it, the subtitle is what stays in my mind, but the title of it is basically, Killings in Glina. And then the subtitle is what I think is, his whole reason for writing the book is a subtitle. The Ustasha Terror and Genocide. And the whole reason for the book is essentially to make sure that a label is attached to this violence. That's it. The book does not engage with social science literature on violence in any language. It does not read like a book that we would read even on genocide in this part of the world. It's really just about making sure that this violence has that legal category and moralized stamp attached to it firmly and forever. And part of that is related to the context in Croatia today, where there's a denial by not all, but some Croatian historians, and more so among the political classes, that not just Glina, but 1941 in general, in the independent state of Croatia, can be considered to be genocide. So this is maybe where I can try and springboard to Srebrenica. I'm going to give a talk on Srebrenica tomorrow, so I should start thinking about this. I have my talk ready, but this question is a good one. So when that when the need to have violence labeled in such a way is so existential, research is impoverished. This is my view. In my first book, which actually won an honorable mention for the Institute for Genocide Studies, when my first book came out, I never used the word genocide in over 400 pages, very purposefully. I believe the word matters to people, and I respect that. I don't see its use in my own work, other than to essentially provide kind of political and moral capital for people who want to continuously fight about violence rather than understand it, which is how I see my job as a historian. Srebrenica is a similar situation where that label for certain groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina must be attached. It's a core part of what used to be called Bosnian Muslim, today is now called Bosniak identity. That is a core part of what it means to be a Bosniak, at least for those of a more nationalist orientation in Bosnia today. And in Belgrade, denying it, just like in Banja Luka, that is to say in the Serbian-administered part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, denying it is also very important as well, or we might call it existential. So those kinds of graffitis and glorifying the generals, Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic and others, those are very common to see in Belgrade, and you see other kinds of graffitis in the Republika Srpska as well. It's a very fraught terrain to be on because, like this talk I'm going to give tomorrow, I propose in an article that I published in the Journal of Genocide Research that historians of Srebrenica should consider doing more than simply arguing that it's genocide. Not to say that that claim is wrong. It's legally enshrined. I mean, I'm not here to dispute it, but I think there are other kinds of questions we can ask. I think that label already sends us on a path where we divide people into black and white categories, where we deny very complicated individual behavior in extreme circumstances. And so the article I wrote, I analyze 3 cases where we see what I call uncomfortable evidence. Evidence where we see people acting in ways that are very hard to make sense of, that don't allow us to, they can be turned into the genocide finding, but what I see there is a lot more than that. So I think scholars need to, it's a very fraught terrain to be on. I don't know exactly what kind of research you've done, but it's a place where you can easily be sucked in and you're sort of forced to take up sides, not in a scholarly discussion, but in a political discussion. I mean, the two obviously have linkages, but I've managed to avoid it. I gave a talk on the Bosnian translation of my book in Belgrade, and one of the questions was, yes or no? It was kind of like a testimony in front of Stefanik in Congress, like, yes or no, was 1941 a genocide of the Serbs? Yes or no? And I just said, I'm not a lawyer. That was my answer. I didn't mean to be cute, but I think it's a fraught terrain to be on, and not just in this part of the world. Obviously, Israel-Palestine is another whole place where I'm not so sure we understand that violence in all of its complexity and history when that word genocide dominates every conversation. And it's not to diminish the suffering of people. But as a historian, I've found it to be more perilous than useful. That's my personal view. Thanks for your question. Yeah. Sure. I think you were next. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. Is this on even? This talk. I'm not an expert on this area, but what really I wanted to probe a little more. I know I'm going to make it short because there's other people, but I'm really drawn to the focus on the monumentality of and the use of buildings. I'm teaching a design school in the memory trauma, leading to this kind of competitive memory trauma. I think that's an interesting story, and I guess I have 2 questions, because I think that you might be able to make an argument about path dependency, that how it ends up and emerging back, thinking about the decisions made about the physicality. So my first question is, I'm really intrigued as to why they left that lot unbuilt. So that speaks. It's not addressing, it's saying something to not build there. So a little more about the decision at what point 6 years later to build something there. Again, why the authorities allowed the church to be built on another site and still keep this place open. There's something happening. Maybe in your historical records there's a conversation about that. But then later, if you think about the decisions of the forms of the monumentality, so a reading place as opposed to a church, but those are all like sovereign, identifying some kind of sovereign authority. Why those decisions were made, and why was not more effort put into the rebuilding of the small town in the ways that it was before 1941? As you mentioned when you started your talk, how groups lived together, played together on fields, etc. So I'm coming again from the physicality of the built environment. If you had a little more information, because it seems to me that that's driving the story, the decisions, the app or the failure to make, or the decision not to make decisions about space is what accelerated the anger to kind of claim it. So.
Thanks. Well, let's take a few more questions, and I'll if I don't answer all of your questions, remind me of a few when we get to them. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. A related question, actually. So how do you explain that the communist authorities at the time, so 1966, for example, built the other monuments, for example, Jasenovac, where there were also Serb victims and Jewish victims, but not in this place in particular. So I'm really interested to hear about that. And then one comment as well, the stories travel and they get kind of a life cycle of their own. And this story obviously traveled from 1941 over the 60s, where there was no memorialization, to 1991, when this story got a different meaning. So to me, the way you told the story between 1941 up to 1991, it was a typical story of uncovering, a crime and there were many other. I don't know if you've seen the movie about Diana Budisavljevic. So it's a kind of a similar story where something was covered and it was accidentally found. But then in 1991, it becomes part of a different story where there's historical revisionism going on outside Glina itself. There is, national mobilization going on in that region in particular, but then in former Yugoslavia as well. So this small story kind of becomes part of that other bigger story, which is beginning to unfold in 1991. And I think the risk for documenting this particular crime is that it becomes part of the nationalist mobilization that's going on in 1991, where the value of it as, documenting a crime and memorializing a crime is being lost when it kind of becomes part of, the symbols and everything of this new narrative that's unfolding.
Thank you.
I also found it really fascinating. I was wondering actually about whether you had any examples of memory that was honored, of like victims of not the own group, but a different group. And also specifically, I also thought about the concentration camps and the Holocaust, the Nazi camps that were in Croatia at that time and also operated mostly by those Croatian forces. So to what extent you talk about that in the book, and also to what extent does Croatia acknowledge those crimes, or does it treat it the same way as they treat this case or maybe other cases? Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. My question is, actually, this is very interesting example for me in my own research, how this idea of revenge and nation-state building, construction, nation, ethnic homogenization, and memory construction are connected with each other. So if you could a little bit, please elaborate on the levels of nation-state building during 90s. Like, how is this nation-state construction process what it tells about this idea of revenge, like how the nation-state building process can shed light into this mass violence happening on the ground.
Okay, great question. Any others before I try to answer all of these in 2 minutes? This is the speed round. Okay, so there are some questions had multiple parts. I'll do my best to answer what I can, and we can chat after as well. So one of the things you said initially that I really found interesting that hadn't occurred to me in any of my work on this project is path dependency. This doesn't exactly connect to your question, but it made me just think about the ways in which each particular type of memory, each particular type of silencing kind of sets up the framework for what comes next, right? And that in many ways is what creates this kind of, symmetry that I'm trying to wrestle with that I think is the more interesting, disturbing, and potentially almost like liberating part of the story, right? That we see, to put it in these terms, like we see ourselves more similar than different. And the path dependency in many ways is kind of the underappreciated part of that, because when mutually exclusive myths are told, the path dependency is completely covered over, right? We don't see the interconnectedness of the ways in which the memories feed off of each other. So I thought that was very interesting. Why the empty space? How is that kind of a statement in and of itself? Like, not doing something is still a decision, right? Of course, it's a very important decision. I think it's important to, and I probably didn't emphasize this enough in the talk, to realize the fears that the communists had of the religious authorities at this time, and their ability, but also their perceived ability to really stoke the fires of nationalism. And so it doesn't mean that this was necessarily the smartest decision they took. You could think about it in different ways, but the documents that I've read suggest that they were simply terrified to allow a new church to be built there. The church itself owned property 1 street over, 2 blocks down. And so by the early 1960s, they granted permission for it to be built there, and they provided 0 funds. Serbs in Toronto and in Chicago and in other parts of the diaspora were essentially those who gave the money. So there was a kind of almost international component to reconstructing this new site of memory there. The questions about Jasenovac are interesting as well. That's a site where the majority of victims were in fact Serbian, but also others, right? Jews, Roma, communists, others were killed there. And it also fits into a context, particularly if we think about the contemporary period, where the government of Croatia can show itself to the world as a state that commemorates the death, the mass murder of Jews, and to be part of that more European-wide memory, while at the same time not necessarily leading with a story about Croatian violence against Serbs. So Jasenovac in some ways is a very useful site of memory in the contemporary moment, in a way that Glina is not, in a way that the vast majority of killing that took place in the independent state of Croatia in these rural localities where Jews were not among the victims, that is what is being silenced. Jasenovac is something that has a different kind of political capital to it, I would argue. But there we also saw, all the way through the 1960s, early part of the 1960s, nothing done there. No bodies unearthed, no commemoration. The mobilization of there was driven by survivors and others. And so it was only by the mid-1960s that very kind of modest movement to, or I should say the early 1960s, modest movement to kind of bring the site into some kind of, shall we say, condition, and then Bogdanovic was brought in to build a large memorial there. So there's a difference between these sites in terms of how they're useful to governments and what governments actually want to do. Nation-state building, I think it's a very important question, and I think a place like Glina is incredibly useful to two, what seem to be on the surface diametrically opposed forms of nationalism and ethnic identity. One, on the Serbian side, wants to see it as a place where genocide occurred, and that is now part of the story that particular entity, that particular group wants to emphasize. They do not want to emphasize 91 to 95 when they themselves were also perpetrators. In terms of Croatian state building, Glina is a useful place because it shows the heroism of the Croatian army in retaking a town and putting it back into the heart of Croatia. And the story from 1995 forward of the exodus of the Serbs, or as some people call it, the ethnic cleansing of Serbs, as well as the silencing of 1941, those are stories that don't need to be part of that narrative. So a place like Glina really brings into sharp focus the ways in which political elites, those of a minority status or those of the majority, pick and choose in very significant ways what took place in a small town like this for their particular purpose. So I think it's absolutely part of the nation-building process. It just works in very different ways, and it's interesting how one small place can be used in such diametrically opposed ways. If someone were to ask me, what's a better approach? Right? That's a legitimate question to ask a historian, right? Like, you're always talking about the past, what about the future, right? So I wrote an article that came out last year in History and Memory where I I thought the piece would never be accepted, but I included like 7 pages of what I called like historically informed imagination. What would, like the town whose story I told in Bosnia, what would a landscape of memory there look like if we were to try and build like what Nguyen calls a just memory? And so I took the reader on a tour through the town, like imagine we were walking together through the town. And I used my knowledge of history to simply say, at this particular place lived the leader of the local Ustashas, and today it's a cafe, and no one knows that he was here and mobilized the Ustashas to attack Serbian neighbors. And then I would walk on further and say, on this particular bridge, Serbian insurgents, some of whom killed Muslims, saved Muslims on this bridge. And so over these 7 pages, I essentially tried to show what I call these mutually coexisting truths. In all of these places, we see stories that have to be told and don't necessarily need to be reconciled, but cannot be silenced. It's not about creating one particular narrative that everyone accepts, but it's not allowing anything to be excluded. And there's a kind of tension in that, but I almost feel like that's a more realistic approach to reconciliation. Reconciliation is not about accepting a narrative, it's about acknowledging that people feel differently. And they acknowledge that we feel differently as well. So that won't probably win me many friends in Croatia, but that I think is kind of something I'm thinking about going forward. And that piece can be read and critiqued and enjoyed or hated or whatever works for you. So.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's
Thanks.
a great ending.